I say new economic era because today's economy defies many of the core principles of traditional economic theory. We have been operating under the long-held assumption that persistent budget deficits and rising government debt would increase interest rates and inflation, harming our economy over the long run. However, contrary to these predictions, we've seen interest rates and inflation fall to record lows, while debt has soared to its highest level since just after World War II. We are truly in a new era that has economists reassessing entire economic theories in light of these unexpected outcomes. If the Budget Committee is to promote effective and responsible fiscal policy, it's important that we learn more and participate in this growing debate. In our hearing last week, Federal Reserve Chair Powell made it clear that the fiscal challenge we face is a long-term one, not an immediate crisis. Our aging population and growing healthcare costs have put our debt on an unsustainable path. We will need to take steps to address this issue over the next several decades. But in the meantime, persistently low interest rates have made reducing deficits in the near term less urgent, even counterproductive given the risk to economic growth. It has also increased Congress's fiscal space, empowering lawmakers to make responsible investments now that will improve our future economic outlook. But that doesn't mean we should be spending like a drunken sailor without thought or discretion. I apologize to any current or former sailors in the room. Deficits and what they're used for matter. Failing to tackle severe and persistent infrastructure, education, and health gaps is arguably more damaging to our economic and fiscal outlooks than the risk posed today by higher debt. Policies that support working Americans in an economic downturn provide much-needed investments in our families, communities, and environment, and have a positive impact on our long-term fiscal health, our responsible uses of deficits. Every dollar invested in infrastructure increases near-term economic output by $1.50 and boosts our economy's productivity over time. $1 for pre-disaster mitigation efforts saves $6 in future disaster costs. Investments in children's health care and preschool and college attainment pay for themselves over the long run. Housing programs that move children out of poverty can increase lifetime earnings by $300,000. Moreover, low interest rates will supercharge these investments. They'll be cheaper to make today and likely provide a bigger boost to the economy later. On the other hand, deficit-financed tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations are clearly an irresponsible use of deficits. The Republicans' 2017 tax law is the poster child for wasteful deficit-financed policy. It has failed to provide any meaningful boost to the economy, but increased our debt by at least $1.9 trillion and counting, worsening our already serious revenue problem. Skyrocketing the deficit for this purpose, while uninsured rates increase, air pollution worsens, and our children's reading scores decline, is appalling. At the end of the day, carrying debt still carries risks, but by investing strategically in responsible policies that reflect our nation's values, and by having a more sober and evidence-based understanding of the costs of debt, we can lay the groundwork for a productive and dynamic 21st century economy. I know we will hear different points of view as we examine this, which is the point of this hearing. But despite critical differences, both mainstream and alternative schools of thought increasingly agree that government debt appears to be less risky, less costly, and less urgent than traditional economic thought suggests. Today's hearing will provide a platform for experts and policymakers to share their ideas, whether practical or aspirational, conventional or controversial. Once again, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what they believe Congress can and should be doing in this new economic era, how we can invest responsibly in our future, and what fiscal policies best support American families. With that, I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Womack.
I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I think it's an appropriate continuation of the conversation we began last week with the Federal Reserve chairman. Last week, I likened Chairman Powell's assessment of the economy to a checkup with your doctor. We received an encouraging bill of health. Our economy is strong. Forward momentum continues thanks to the pro-growth policies enacted last Congress and under this administration. Americans are confident, and rightly so. We should certainly celebrate this historic economic prosperity, but cannot ignore the fact that we continue to face serious long-term fiscal challenges, particularly the ever-increasing federal debt. Simply put, the debt is on a completely unsustainable trajectory. The national debt is $23+ trillion and is projected to grow to more than $34 trillion within a decade. Soon thereafter, on our current path, the federal debt will reach the highest level in American history as a percentage of our economy. CBO also projects that by 2049, the federal debt will equal $248,000 per American, almost $1 million for each family of four. After that, it continues to grow. Interest payments will increasingly crowd out the other federal spending that is directed toward programs many Americans rely on. CBO projects interest payments on the debt will amount to $390 billion in fiscal 20, an 11% amount of our federal tax revenue. Mr. Chairman, your hearing title provocatively asks us to re-examine the debt, and I suspect we will hear from some voices today that suggest we should not worry too much about it, or we will hear it's the wrong time to deal with it. Allow me to underscore just how irresponsible that thought process is. The way our government is operating is the same as an American family trying to make difficult financial decisions about mortgages, health insurance, and bills, when they must first direct a significant portion of their family budget just toward paying the interest on a growing credit card balance. We call that the minimum payment due. Not only is this the way we're doing business fiscally irresponsible and unsustainable, CBO also found that a growing federal debt has a negative impact on business investment, productivity, and economic growth. It simply does not make sense to champion our present economic successes while ignoring the long-term challenge that is the debt. I hope we can have a realistic discussion today about the scenarios that are in front of us in the future. We could do nothing. We could try not to make things worse. We could spend even more and add new mandatory spending programs like we did yesterday on the CR, as many in this institution are proposing. Or we could work together and address the debt. What happens to the economy and the financial future of our children and grandchildren under each of these scenarios? I certainly don't want my grandkids to see the crisis scenario in which the interest rate on the debt will skyrocket abruptly because investors will no longer have confidence in our government's ability to pay its bills. That's why I'm seriously concerned that it seems today as though many lawmakers have shifted from a willingness to address the debt with real bipartisan solutions, and instead are buying into this modern monetary theory, which tells us that the debt doesn't matter because we can essentially just print more money. This notion is absurd. We cannot simply wish our problems away. Last week, before this very committee, Chairman Powell made the point himself that when he said the idea that the debt doesn't matter is simply wrong. Yet our colleagues serving in the House use this theory to justify the cost of programs like the Green New Deal. So at this point, I cannot help but wonder how many neutral outside experts Congress needs to hear from before we wake up and act. Congress must come together in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion to reduce the debt, deliver on our Article I responsibilities, and make good on our responsibility to the American people who have to balance their own budgets each month. Finally, I'd like to congratulate my friend, Mr. Burchett from Tennessee, the former mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, and Mr. Case from Hawaii for working together to introduce a new bipartisan idea to address the national debt. I'm often asked at home, when are you guys going to get together and do something instead of fighting with each other? H.R. 5178 suggests creative approaches for how Congress could look at the debt in a bipartisan way, involving the House and the Senate. I'm proud to support the bill authored by my friend, the mayor from Knox County, and his Democrat co-sponsor, Mr. Case. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back the balance of my time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
I thank the ranking member for his opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other member has an opening statement, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Once again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You each will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Dr. Blanchard, you may begin when you're ready. You know that in Arkansas and Kentucky, you'd be Blanchard, and I don't know how many people on the committee will butcher your name, so I apologize in advance for that. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I've accepted the fact that I'm called Blanchard. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to testify on what I think is really indeed a crucial topic. In my testimony today, I would like to make 5 points. The first, nominal and real interest rates are likely to remain low for a long time to come. Indeed, nominal interest rates are forecast to be lower than the growth rate of nominal GDP for the next 20 years. Now, this being said, it is not an absolute certainty, and one should indeed be ready to act if the circumstances changed. That was the first point. The second point is that, as a matter of logic, low real rates have three implications for fiscal policy. Fiscal costs are lower. The cost of debt, inflation adjusted, is currently negative, slightly negative, more or less zero. Primary deficits, which are the deficits not including interest payments on the debt, must be offset by primary surpluses in the future, but smaller primary surpluses. In other ways, lower taxes today require smaller increases in taxes in the future, just again, as a matter of arithmetic. Fiscal risks are also smaller. The probability that there is a market-induced debt crisis in the US, reflecting the inability of the government to pay its bills, is smaller or more or less non-existent for the moment. So this is implications of low rates for fiscal policy. My third point is about implications of low rates for monetary policy, and we're all familiar with what these implications are. The low nominal rates put sharp limits on the use of monetary policy, and the most that the Federal Reserve can do is to stimulate the economy, is to decrease nominal interest rates to zero or very close to zero. Once at the lower bound, monetary policy cannot help, but fiscal policy can. That's, I think, a very central point. Fourth, as a result of my first 3 points, the implication is on the one hand, lower fiscal costs and higher potential benefits imply a larger role for fiscal policy as a macro stabilization tool. Put another way, the trade-off between debt stabilization and output stabilization has shifted as a result of low rates in the direction of output stabilization. We should be relatively more concerned about output stabilization than debt stabilization. My fifth point is to try to translate these general principles into concrete conclusions about US fiscal policy. And here I see two main implications. First, the deficits are running at a bit above 5% of GDP at this point, and they are very large. So unless they are used to finance an ambitious and credible public investment plan or ambitious capital spending at various margins, they should be decreased. Decreasing them too fast, however, would be risky because they might well reduce demand, and there is little room for the Fed to offset this decrease in demand through lower interest rates. Therefore, the reduction in the deficit, which is highly desirable, should be contingent on the strength of private demand. This strategy might lead to further increases in the ratio of debt to GDP from the already fairly high levels, but I believe that it is an acceptable risk, that maintaining output is very, very important. The second and final conclusion is that if a recession materialized, monetary policy would be likely constrained. There is very little room of maneuver, making it essential to use fiscal policy. Automatic stabilizers, which is a fiscal instrument which has been used in the past, are too weak in the US to do the job. Better ones, focusing, for example, on larger payments to low-income households, should be designed soon. This is an urgent matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And now, Dr. Randall Wray, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. In my statement, I argue that federal deficits and debt are not so scary. Neither is on an unsustainable path. Rather, persistent deficits and rising debt are normal. They're not due to out-of-control spending, now or in the future. They serve a useful public purpose. They're largely outside the control of Congress. And it's hard to imagine a scenario in which they create a financial crisis, lead to insolvency or high inflation, or trigger an attack by bond vigilantes. I want to focus on two graphs to back up these claims, and I don't know if these can be shown. Okay, there we go. Figure 1 shows sectoral balances. In the aggregate, spending equals income. One sector can run a surplus only if at least one other runs a deficit. The government sector is in red in this graph, and except for the Clinton years, it is always in deficit, below the line. The private sector is blue, including firms and households. It's almost always in surplus, except for the decade after 1996, when the private sector spent more than its income. The foreign sector is green and in surplus since the Reagan years. That's because we run a current account deficit reflected in our trade deficit. So the usual case is the government's deficit equals the sum of the private sector's surplus and the foreign surplus against us. This is an identity. You can't change one without changing at least one other balance. Those wanting to eliminate deficits have to tell us which of the other two balances will change to allow that to happen. Will they put the private sector in deficit? That's what happened in the dot-com and housing bubbles, leading to the global financial crisis. Or we'll get foreigners to run trade deficits? How? We've had a current account deficit for 40 years. Understanding sectoral balances shows why the federal balance is not under control of Congress, as it depends on the other two sectors. Finally, let's address the bond vigilantes and projections of exploding interest payments on the debt. Figure 11 shows debt service is driven by interest rates, not by the debt ratio. And interest rates are determined by monetary policy, not by the debt ratio, nor by bond vigilantes. So what do I recommend going forward? I actually agree with a lot of the comments made. We don't need tax hikes or spending constraint now, when growth seems to be moderating and there's no inflationary pressure. Indeed, doing that now might depress growth so that the deficit would actually increase, as it always does in recession. The time to rein in the deficit will be when growth booms and inflation threatens. I'm not saying all deficits are good and created equal. I prefer well-targeted taxes and spending. The recent tax cuts were inefficient because the main beneficiaries were high-income earners. This raised the deficit without boosting growth. It makes sense to shift taxes away from low to moderate incomes and onto high income and wealth. That raises consumption and encourages investment. Spending should be targeted to job creation and productivity increases. I don't take long-term projections very seriously. I remember when President Clinton projected budget surpluses for 15 years, retiring all the debt. The dot-com crash wiped out the surplus, and we've had deficits ever since. We at the Levy Institute warned in 1997 that that would happen. Current CBO projections have the debt ratio rising continuously. This is based on the twin erroneous assumptions that debt raises interest rates and lowers investment and growth through crowding out. That ignores positive impacts of deficits on the private sector surpluses. This doesn't crowd out spending, but it increases net wealth and encourages growth. Instead of worrying about long-term projections that will be wrong, we should focus on formulating good policy today. So I suggest 3 recommendations. First, strengthen the automatic stabilizers. Spending should be more counter-cyclical, while taxes should be pro-cyclical. Policy changes weakened them over the past decades. Second, if discretionary policy is possible, raise taxes or cut spending only when the economy is overheating. There's no point adopting austerity today, only because the deficit might be bigger in the distant future. And finally, increase efficiency of both spending and taxing. The goal should be sustainable growth, rising living standards, reduction of inequality, and not to achieve some arbitrary deficit or debt number. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Bernstein for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, I thank you for the chance to speak to this evolving area where economics intersects public finance. My testimony starts by noting that current deficits are unusually high for this stage of the economic recovery, and yet these deficits are not pushing up interest rates or inflation. If the increased flow of deficits and the resulting higher stock of debt are not having obvious negative economic consequences, does that mean deficits don't matter and policymakers should blithely put all of their preferences on the national credit card? My answer is no. The evidence does not relieve policymakers of budget constraints. It does not negate the revenue-robbing impact of the 2017 tax cuts that, in my framing, are Exhibit A in wasteful, inequitable debt accumulation. But the evidence provides a more nuanced, far less cramped understanding of the economic costs of budget deficits and the potential benefits from investing in people in places who have long needed the help. The coexistence of high deficits and debt amid low interest rates belies the traditional crowd-out arguments where public and private borrowing compete over a fixed lump of capital. In fact, our economy is large and open with deep, liquid global credit markets, and our debt is considered among the world's safest to invest excess savings. The central bank is also in the mix. The Fed has kept its benchmark interest rate below 1% for most of the past decade and convinced investors that inflation would remain low and stable. Other evidence suggests that deficits are not leading to faster inflation and higher rates because the U.S. economy has not been operating at full capacity. For either public or private spending to generate overheating conditions, aggregate demand must exceed supply, such that any extra demand, say for more deficit spending, would generate not more jobs and higher real incomes, but just more inflation. Priors in this area of economics also require updating, most notably regarding the lowest unemployment rate, thought to be consistent with stable prices. Thus, it is a serious mistake to assume that deficits will pressure interest rates, especially when there's economic slack, strong capital flows, excess savings over investment, and well-anchored inflation. Moreover, with the economy's growth rate outpacing the relevant interest rate, the fiscal cost of debt stabilization is diminished. These facts should push strongly against knee-jerk, austere fiscal policy. But they should not obviate concerns about our persistent fiscal imbalances. First, interest rates could eventually rise, such that we'd be servicing a much larger stock of debt, thus devoting a larger share of national income to debt payments. Prudent risk management does not assign a zero probability to higher future rates. Second, financing more of our public debt with foreign capital has led to an increasing share of our GDP leaking out through debt payments abroad. Back in 1970, public debt held by foreigners amounted to less than 2% of GDP. Most recently, that share was 30%. Third, and this is the concern that I find most worrisome, is the lack of, quote, perceived versus actual fiscal space. When the next recession hits, the Federal Reserve will reduce the cost of credit, but because interest rates have been so low, the Fed is likely to have reduced monetary space, less room to lower their benchmark interest rate. Countercyclical fiscal policy does not face an analogous limit. However, were Congress to take insufficient action to offset a downturn, it would be a fateful mistake, one that would disproportionately harm those who are already economically vulnerable and who are least insulated from recessions. In closing, our evolving understanding of the role of fiscal debt provides us with both opportunities and risks. The former implies more leeway to use deficit spending to make necessary productive investments. The latter means avoiding adding to our already historically elevated debt for non-productive or wasteful spending and/or tax cuts. It is thus essential to divine good debt from bad debt. Good debt invests in people and places that need the help. Bad debt does not. Considering the set of unmet needs we observe in communities across the country, along with the threat from climate change, there exists a deep, rich set of good debt investment opportunities. Tens of millions remain or underinsured in terms of health coverage. The impact of climate change is already being felt in volatile and costly weather patterns. The cost of college is a constraint to many families of moderate means. Much of our public infrastructure needs upgrading. Long-term wage stagnation has constrained the living standards of many working households, and there are significant swaths of people and places that have been left out of the current expansion. I'm happy to elaborate on what I believe are good debt opportunities in those spaces during our future discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And now, finally, Dr. John Taylor, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me to testify on this important topic, reexamining the economic costs of debt. At previous hearings of this committee, at which I testified, including a 2015 meeting, was titled, "Why Congress Must Balance the Budget." In that hearing, I showed that basic economic theory, grounded in real-world data, implies that high federal government debt has a cost. It reduces real GDP and real income per household compared to what these would be with lower debt levels. A re-examination of the economic costs conducted for this hearing yields the same results. In work with John Kogan, Volker Wieland, and myself, we used modern economic models to estimate the effect of a decline in federal expenditures as a share of GDP. This fiscal consolidation plan led to an immediate and permanent increase in real GDP, according to the model calculations. Similar fiscal consolidation strategies were simulated in later years. Recently, the Congressional Budget Office reported similar results. They compared their extended baseline, in which the debt goes to 144% of GDP, with an extended alternative fiscal scenario, in which the federal debt goes up to 219% of GDP. This alternative scenario has the total deficit rising to 15.5% compared with 8.7% in their extended baseline. The CBO also finds that real GDP is 3.6% lower when the debt is higher. So clearly, according to these analyses, the higher debt has real economic costs. The CBO also analyzed scenarios in which the debt is lower as a share of GDP, 42% and 78%. In the 42% scenario, real GDP would be 5.8% higher. In the 78% scenario, real GDP would be 3.7% higher. With the Congressional Budget Office's currently projected increase in the deficit and the federal debt in the United States, this reexamination implies the need for a credible fiscal consolidation strategy. Under such a strategy, spending still grows, but at a slower rate than GDP, at least for a while, thereby reducing both spending as a share of GDP and the debt as a share of GDP, compared with current projections. Such a fiscal strategy would greatly benefit the American economy. It would also reduce the risk of the debt spiraling up much faster than is currently projected by the CBO. I believe these conclusions are robust to different ways of thinking about the world. Professor Blanchard has emphasized that if the growth rate of the economy is greater than the relevant interest rate in the public debt, then there will be a tendency for the debt to GDP ratio to decline over time. In many of the simulations reported by Professor Blanchard, the primary deficit is held to zero. However, any projection at this point has the primary deficit far, far above zero, and according to the Congressional Budget Office, it's growing over time. Moreover, the economic costs reported here do not distinguish between the primary and the total deficit. It is the increase in the debt via the total deficit that creates economic costs. Of course, different views of the relative size of the growth rate and the interest rate are important, but they do not diminish the estimated costs of high debt. Another view of the economic costs of debt is related to what is sometimes called modern monetary theory. It's difficult to determine how this approach would work in the future, and it is frequently associated with large spending programs and even wage and price controls. Model simulations would be useful, to be sure, but history can also be a valuable guide. In the 1970s, the United States imposed wage and price controls, and the Federal Reserve helped finance the deficit by creating money. The result was a terrible economy, with unemployment and inflation both rising. This ended when money growth was reduced in the late 70s and early 80s. As explained in a new book by George Schultz and myself, it is an example where poor economic reasoning led to poor economic policy, which led to poor economic performance. It was only reversed when good economics again prevailed and policy changed. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and once again, thanks to all the witnesses. We will now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and the answers from our witnesses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. The ranking member and I will defer our questions until the end. So I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding such an important hearing. I feel a little bit like being at a panel where I've just listened to the 4 leading cosmologists in the world talk about string theory, multiverses, black holes, the origin of the universe. And my first question is like, how does gravity work? So I apologize because this was a lot to process. But I did want to just go back to, and I think perhaps Dr. Bernstein, you touched on this as maybe you all did to some degree, but textbook economic theory, as I understand it, predicts that persistent budget deficits and rising government debt essentially raises interest rates, fuels inflation, crowds out, as you talked about, or depresses private investment and triggers financial and fiscal difficulties. We're obviously not seeing that. The publicly held debt, I think in the United States, is roughly 80% of GDP. It has actually grown, which I think is unusual to grow as a percentage of GDP during an economic expansion, which we've seen over the last 10 or 11 years. The 10-year note is at lower interest rates than it was 20 years ago. So since that was the sort of expectations and it hasn't played out, is it that the assumptions that we made are incorrect, or are we in sort of a unique period, or the circumstances have changed where no longer those expected results are present? And what's the lesson that we as policymakers should take from that?
I think it's more accurate to say that the assumptions were right at one point in time and they no longer are. So in my testimony, I show a scatter plot between budget deficits and interest rates. And actually, if you go back a few decades, that lines up pretty negatively, much like the theory would predict. And by the way, you comprehended everything that we were talking about perfectly well. So just being clear that we're on the same page here. But as I stressed in my testimony, dynamics, global credit, the role of the Federal Reserve, anchored inflationary expectations, excess savings over global investment, all of those have contributed to fundamentally change the relationship such that the crowd-out hypothesis simply doesn't bind in the data. Now, I try to be very clear in my testimony that that doesn't mean that interest rates won't go up and create a serious problem for us. I think the way I put it was that it's not good risk management to assume a zero threat from that possibility. But it's really that the old assumptions no longer hold.
I'd like to just shift. Last week we had the Fed Chair, Chairman Powell was here, talked about debt level sustainability, and I just want to read what he said. I would define sustainable as the debt is not growing faster than the economy. Our debt is growing faster than our economy now by a margin, and so by definition it makes it unsustainable. You have to have an economy that is growing faster than your debt, and you have to do that for 10 to 20 years. That's how you successfully handle this. If you don't do it, over time you'll be crowding out private investment. I'm just curious, Dr. Bernstein, as a follow-up, would you agree with that, or would you dissent from that view?
I would broadly dissent in the spirit that I just showed you. I think it's really an empirical question. However, John Taylor makes a fair point when he says that, yes, it's true that growth rates surpass interest rates, but because the primary deficit, or the deficit net of interest payments, has been large and growing, that is putting upward pressure on the debt. I don't think that means that crowd out is around the corner, or at least in any perspective that I can see. I think what it does mean is that to the extent that we do engage in deficit spending, it should be on the kinds of productive, I put it under the rubric of good debt.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask a question on something else, but the automatic stabilizers, and perhaps someone else will ask about that. But while you're on the subject, could you just define perhaps a couple of examples of bad debt? You mentioned some of good.
I think the most, I think the Exhibit A is really a debt that comes from tax cuts, and particularly tax cuts that are regressive. That is, that return far more benefits to those at the top of the wealth scale. To me, that's a classic example of both inequitable, revenue-robbing, bad debt.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As of today, it's been 219 days since the deadline has passed for us to propose a budget in this committee. While this committee might not realize it, there is several reasons why we go through the budget process. One, it gives guidelines to the appropriators. Two, in a budget resolution, we also set the 302A number allocations, which establishes the overall spending numbers. Yesterday on the floor, we saw a continuing resolution passed again, yet we still don't have the 302A numbers. I'm glad that this committee hearing at least is moving more towards a hearing that a budget committee would have when you're talking about the national debt. So I think that at least that's a step in the right direction, even though we're 219 days behind. Earlier this, I just want to make a comment in regards to what some of the witnesses had said earlier about good debt, investing in people. Mr. Bernstein made that statement. I think a lot of times folks up here in the swamp get confused and they think of government-funded, government spending, but it's not government-funded, it's not government spending, it's not government debt. It's taxpayer spending, taxpayer-funded, and taxpayer debt. So when we talk about debt, it's not government debt, it's taxpayer debt. It's every one of the 320 plus million Americans that have the debt. And let's not get blinded by a different entity by saying government, because it all has to be paid for someday, and it's all the citizens of this country. It's the taxpayers. So remember the difference between government debt and taxpayer debt. It is taxpayer debt. I know the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was brought up a couple times. I represent a congressional district that is one of the poorest in the nation. And I can tell you under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, where our median household income of a family of 4 is just right at $40,000 a year, the people of my district benefited greatly from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And a family of 4 with a median income household of $40,000 is not a lot. It is in the lowest bracket of median household incomes in the nation of 435 congressional districts. And I can tell you by traveling the 30 counties of Southeast and South Central Missouri how people have benefited from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act by the doubling of the standard deduction, by the doubling of the child tax credit. These were real numbers that helped drive the economy in a very rural, impoverished economy. So I do know that there was huge benefits, and there wasn't any robbing of the poor people in Southeast Missouri. In fact, they benefited from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, at least the people that I represent in the 30 counties that call 20,000 square miles home in Southeast Missouri. You know, the Boot Hill of Missouri used to be a swamp, by the way, and we drained it. And now it's some of the most fertile land in the country, and I think that's what President Trump's trying to do up here in Washington, D.C., and let's hope that it's working. Mr. Taylor, I have a question for you. CBO reports that an increasing public debt harms per capita gross national product, whereas reducing the debt improves per capita gross national product. Given the negative consequences of our nation's current fiscal path, if we were to actually legislate and put the federal budget on a sustainable course, what would be the positive economic effects?
I believe if the plan, if you like, the credible consolidation plan, budget deficit reduction plan, was somehow passed or agreed to, it's multi-year to be best, to be sure, so it's credible, I think it would have a beneficial effect on the economy. So often the models that people use emphasize any reduction in government spending of any kind is contractionary. I don't believe that's the case. If it's credible, if it's understood, if it's planned, it's been beneficial. And that's what our models show, that's what our simulations show. I think it would be a benefit to have, and people have talked about this in the past, a strategy to reduce the debt to GDP over time, and it would be beneficial according to models that I use and I think other people have used. So I would very much hope that that would be the direction. I know it's not what you're focused on right now, but I wish there was more focus on that. Multi-year discussion, what's going to happen. If you look at the expenditure growth, it's astounding what's happened, what's being projected. So I think that needs to be fixed.
I see my time expired, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Yarmouth, and to the ranking member. I know we're here today to re-examine how we view debt and deficits with respect to our economy. And my good friend, Mr. Smith from Missouri, he and I serve on the Ways and Means Committee as well. We've had some good, lively debate in both this committee and our other committee. But what I find interesting sometimes is that the other side will view tax cuts for the very wealthy as investments. But when we talk about investing in resources and programs that we know will benefit our children and their future, somehow that's not something that's worth investing in. So I want to go directly to the numbers that impact my constituents. Mr. Smith talked about his. During the 2017-2018 school year, Nevada, which has 355 Title I schools, over 200,000 children in those schools. Clark County is the 5th largest school district in the country. Nearly half of the students are Latino students, limited English proficient students. Had we received the full allocation of funding, we would have been budgeted $379 million in Title I funding from the federal government. However, our schools received only $130 million. That's $250 million funding deficit for our students that need it the most. And I've been to these schools. I've seen what these teachers are dealing with overcrowded classrooms, with inadequate textbooks, with not having the after-school resources, early childhood investments that we know will improve the educational outcomes of young people and improve their quality of life. Let me give you another example to turn to the chart. We've seen cuts to various skills training programs such as the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act and the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, as well as adult education. As you can see from this chart, WIOA was funded at $4.6 billion in fiscal year 2001. These are programs to train people for the 21st skills of the future. But it only received $2.8 billion in funding for fiscal year 2019. So, Mr. Bernstein and Dr. Bacard, do you think the long-term economic and fiscal consequences of neglecting investments in critical areas such as education and skills training could be more damaging than the consequences of increasing our debt?
I'll start. I mean, I do worry about precisely that, and this is a good example of what I'm talking about when I say good investment in terms of deficit spending versus wasteful, inequitable spending. And it's important to just broaden out your comments slightly. I'll get out of the way so Olivia can jump in. One force that's clearly not driving the debt ratio forecast that we've all been talking about is precisely this kind of spending. So this is non-defense discretionary spending. It's expected to fall to historical lows as a share of GDP. This is precisely the area where we should be investing, is where we're doing the least.
Dr. Bacard?
I very much agree. I think the deficits as they are now are not used for the right purposes. There's a number of programs, measures which could increase growth, decrease inequality. It would be a much better use of these deficits than is currently the case.
Thank you. So I just want to note, Mr. Chairman, that the President and my Republican colleagues, again, passed a $1.9 trillion tax cut. And they did so in 51 days without one hearing. They rammed through that job tax cut bill. That $1.9 trillion my Republican colleagues in the Trump administration passed, that benefited only the top 1%. That could have been used to fully fund Title I in my state. It could have been to invest in some of these programs that we know people need in order to compete for American jobs. We're talking about getting ready to work on USMCA. Trade is important, but guess what? We also have to invest in our workers in order to have the skills to compete. So when we talk about competition in a global economy, it's trade, it's skills in our workforce, and it's having a competitive tax rate. My colleagues focused on only one of those areas. They did it in 51 days, and they did it without regard to the majority of the American people who would benefit the most. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I unfortunately neglected to, while Mr. Smith was still in the room, to correct one thing he said for the record, and he may have misspoken. But we do have 302A numbers for next year. We don't have 302B yet. We're working on that. But anyway, just wanted to correct that for the record. And now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, each of you, for being here. Let me just reemphasize what Mr. Congressman Smith said. You know, when you say government debt, that is taxpayers' debt. This thing we call government is made up of taxpayers. They're the ones who put the money in the coffers to make government work. So that's not some term that's, I think it's misunderstood or misused by the left. Secondly, I've heard several talk about tax cuts for the rich, tax cut for those at the top. Where did the bonuses come that President Trump, that we passed, that President Trump has put into practice? Where did the bonuses go? It went to people that make up the corporations. So it's interesting that, you know, we talk about this, the thing government in terms as if it's not people. We talk about corporations, the rich. I think the people who have benefited the most are those that have a job now. I think the growth rates under the President Trump are real, as opposed to the obvious low growth rates under the previous administration, which hovered over 1.2, 1.5%. There is a reason people have jobs. There's a reason the growth has occurred in this economy like never before. Mr. Ray, let me ask you, have you ever run a private business?
No.
Okay, so you've never had to hire, make a payroll, balance, I guess other than your household budget, you never had to balance, make a product or make sure things, you're making a profit so that you can pay the police, you can pay our schools, you can pay our first responders. You've never done that?
That's correct.
Okay. Let me ask you about the modern monetary theory, which I think you buy into. And I think the basis of that, tell me if I'm wrong, budget deficits can be financed by nations who control the currency.
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the monetary policy of some Latin American economies, Chile?
Some Latin American countries, yes.
Okay. What about Peru?
Not Peru, no.
Okay. Are you familiar with some of the inflation rates? And I mentioned Chile. Do you remember what that is, the inflation rate in Chile?
No,
It's
I don't.
500%. Do you remember the inflation rate in Peru by just printing money? 7,000%. What about Venezuela? How has that worked out? That was 10,398%. So hyperinflation hurts the little man that you're talking about you protect. You know, in Venezuela today, we're witnessing the effects of a socialistic economy that doesn't work for the people that you say you protect. Those are the consequences of the very monetary policy that you say you promote. And I guess let me ask each one of you, I've got a minute 31, as you look at priorities in this country that we spend on, does the Green New Deal add up as the top priority? And I'd start with, well, Mr. Ray, let me start with you.
I do think that we face a very serious challenge that will require federal government involvement and federal government spending.
What would it cost?
It depends on what you include in the Green New Deal, say.
Pick a number.
Okay, well, say the complete package of greening programs could be as much as 5% of GDP for the next 10 years.
Which is, give me a number. Just pick a number, because I've heard
Okay.
73 trillion, I've heard
No,
not that.
no.
But it's top of the list. Over national defense, over
I don't think that we have to make a choice like that. If we're talking about adding 5% of GDP to total spending, we don't have to eliminate defense. That would bring government spending up to about 25% of GDP.
Okay. Mr. Taylor?
I think the highest priority is to have a faster growing economy, which benefits large parts of this economy, and as you've emphasized.
Which is what the tax cuts have done.
I agree. They have been effective.
Right. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do either of the other two witnesses want to respond to the question? Dr. Blanchard?
The Green New Deal is indeed a priority. Is it the top priority? There are many other things which need to be repaired in this country, from bridges to other infrastructure. Should it be financed by debt or by taxes? I think the answer is by a mix of the two.
The only thing I'll add is when you're contemplating the cost of the Green New Deal or any other action against climate change, it's very important to factor in the costs of not doing anything about climate change. Those costs are becoming increasingly significant, and they must be netted out of whatever numbers we're throwing around.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome such a distinguished panel of economists. I appreciate your patience, because you must know when you come there will be a lot of partisan sparring. I must admit, I actually watched the YouTube video of Mr. Blanchard's address, because when I saw the headline that apparently said, according to the press, that deficits don't matter, I had to see for myself what, in fact, you had said. And I regret the distortions that were made of your AEA speech that prompted some journalists to mischaracterize it. I worry in general that the nuance that's in all of your testimony largely escapes members. So I worry that you end up looking like piñatas hit by whatever is the opposing side at the time, because as we well know, when the other side's in the majority, there'll be 3 John Taylors on the panel instead of the only one we have today. I'm not suggesting you be cloned, but the real issue is whether we can get at the truth. And perhaps a no hearing this year is going to be more important in helping us ferret out the truth. Because as we deal with short-term, medium-term, long-term trade-offs, I worry that there's a certain learned behavior here when we refuse to acknowledge nuance, when we refuse to try to get things right and look beyond the horizon, that we could be committing grave errors today. And literally none of us really has skin in the game, because the average congressional tenure is 6 to 8 years. We'll be gone. Some of you have tenure, even with that, you'll be gone. So our real obligation is to our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And it really matters, even though some of these issues are measured in small percentage points, whether we get it right, because the difference between 1% growth, 3% growth, 5% growth is monumental. I worry that on behalf of your profession, there's not sufficient humility, because my guess is that none of you correctly predicted the 2008 recession, because hardly anyone did, and those who claim they did sometimes exaggerate their foresight. But I think John Maynard Keynes said that all economists should be humble, like dentists. And I'm not seeing, from the profession, a dentist-type humility. Or an ability, because at least dentists have to talk to their patients and try to make sure the patient understands. Brush your teeth every day, otherwise you'll have cavities. So if you could help me understand, because to me there's more commonality in the testimony than would appear on the surface, and yet you're being separated 3 to 1 as if, one side's good, one side's bad. And Dr. Bernstein even characterizes good debt, bad debt. That's a pretty Manichaean view of the world. It all depends on what your favorite programs are. And both parties end up having similar sins. We both love spending if it's our sort of spending. We both decry debt if it's not our sort of debt. So I'm worried we're really talking past each other here. So would any of you admit that there's really more commonality than first appears?
I mean, first of all, let me just say that embedded in my testimony is more humility than perhaps I showed, and I totally agree with your point on that. And the idea is that we should be humble about our ability to predict the future, say the correlation between deficits, debt, and interest rates. And so I really emphasize the empirical relationship, and I think that's the important one. In terms of good debt and bad debt, that's sort of trying to be somewhat of a cute framing to suggest that debt that is incurred in the interest of productive investment is very different than debt that's incurred for what I would consider wasteful tax cuts. Now, we can have a good argument about that, but I just wanted to be clear about that point.
Dr. Blanchard?
Thank you. I thought, listening to the three others, that there was indeed a lot of commonality, in the sense that I think we would all say that debt per se is not good in the long run. That it has, we can disagree about how bad it is, but nobody argued that it was good. There was some difference about the short run. I think three of us believe that if there was a sharp fiscal consolidation, this would lead to a decrease in demand and potentially a recession, which the Fed could not have said. John, I think, was more optimistic about the fact that animal spirits triggered by fiscal consolidation could undo the direct effects. I'm very skeptical of this. But beyond this, I think there was agreement. The last point is, I think there was agreement that if that is used for good stuff, public investment, R&D, growth-enhancing measures, then there's some justification for using that in that case, the same as would be true for a private firm.
I see that my time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the other gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, I want to thank you for your kind words. I think about my folks when somebody says something nice about me, and I hope where they are they can see that. I think they'd be very pleased. I thank you, brother, for that. My question today is for the entire panel, and I'm always concerned about China. It's almost genetic. My father actually, after the Second World War, was in the Marine Corps and actually went to China and fought the communists for a short while, and was, I think, amazed at their abilities that they had, and just their view of totalitarianism and very little regard for human lives, and I think that scared him. And with that, I'd like to know, China, of course, holds the most of our debt with $1.1 trillion. What are the economic impacts if these foreign countries decide to collect on that debt? I hear that a lot. Put it down on my level. I took first quarter economics for a good reason. I was asked to. So second time around, I was told to. So if y'all could, I'd appreciate every one of y'all giving your response.
I think we have to worry about China at various dimensions. That particular one worries me less than some of the others, in the sense that if they were to want to sell the large amount of treasury bills and bonds that they have, they would make a very large capital loss on their holdings. I think that's sufficient reason not to want to do it from their own point of view. So I would not worry very much about the fact that China holds quite a large quantity of U.S. government bonds.
Can I add, if you look at who are the holders of U.S. government bonds abroad, and that's almost half of the debt we've been talking about, they are the exporters to the United States plus offshore banking centers. The way that they get the bonds is by selling output to us. We use dollars to buy it. They accumulate dollar reserves at the Fed, and then they convert those into U.S. treasuries. So as long as China and other exporting nations want to sell their goods to us, they're going to accumulate dollars, and they're going to very rationally convert those to U.S. treasuries. I think that any transition out of U.S. government bonds is going to be very slow. China will eventually run a trade deficit. It's going to become too wealthy, its incomes are going to be too high to be the low-cost exporter in the world. Their population will buy more imports, and so that will reverse, but it's going to be very, very gradual. So I agree with Professor Blanchard. This is really not a worry.
Since I agree with Blanchard, let me just briefly say that if you owe the bank $100, they own you. If you owe bank them $1 million, you own them. That's kind of what Olivia was saying, and I share that view.
Yeah, I think we should be concerned because our debt is growing very rapidly. And many people are buying it. They won't always buy it. There is a risk. And that's not built into the usual forecast, but you can't ignore that. There could be a spiral up, and some people would say, no, that's enough. So I think it's a risk. I think the China is much more than that. I think they seem to be going back away from some of the market principles that made that economy so successful with Deng Xiaoping originally. I think the U.S. needs to be concerned about its own economy, its growth, its tax system, et cetera, and continue to stress that philosophy that we've had for many years and has worked. China seems to be going in the wrong direction. That's bad for them, bad for the world as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all very much for being here.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panelists, for being here. Let's just be clear about a couple of things. First of all, the job creators in the strongest economy in the history of the world, a $21 trillion economy, which is 70% consumption, are the American people. And with higher wages, you have higher demand. With higher demand, you have higher growth. So fiscal policy and tax policy has a major, major impact. Some talk about bad debt, and debt does matter. What is absurd is the hypocrisy of Republican actions that created lots of bad debt that served the interests only of the hyper-rich and not the general good. Two questions. Did the $1.5 trillion over 10 years corporate tax cut produce economic growth beyond that which was projected before the tax cut? It did not, and I would defy anybody to argue the contrary. Did every American household receive $4,000 to $9,000 increase in household income that the White House Council of Economic Advisors explicitly said would occur and on a recurring basis because of the tax cut? Absolutely, it did not. Here's who it benefited, and this is why it's bad debt. In fiscal year 2017, FedEx owed more than $1.5 billion in taxes. The next year, after the full year that the tax cut went into effect, it owed nothing. FedEx's effective tax rate went from 34% in 2017 to less than zero, meaning that the federal government owes FedEx a rebate. FedEx spent $2 billion on stock buybacks and dividend increases in 2019, more than double the amount that FedEx paid for buybacks and dividends in 2017 before the tax cut. The FedEx chief executive officer received $16 million in compensation in 2019, and the 5 top executives below him received compensation averaging $6.2 million in compensation. So it seems to me that it's very, very clear after a very short period of time that this tax cut was bad debt. We spent $1.5 trillion and didn't get any measurable return accruing to the public good. Under President Trump, he has accumulated almost $4 trillion in new debt. That will be by the end of the fiscal year 2020, the final year of his first term. The U.S. budget deficit grew to almost $1 trillion this year, and we project trillion-dollar deficits for the next several years moving forward. Now, it seemed to me a company like FedEx would be promoting good debt for the general purpose. I mean, that's a company, as I understand it, it's a logistics company. They move product by ship, by plane, but a lot by trucks. And my sense is that the better use of debt would have been $1.5 trillion in an infrastructure bill that would have produced economic growth and helped this economy, $21 trillion economy, function much more efficiently. Dr. Bernstein, your thoughts?
Yeah, if you look from the first quarter of 2018, which is when the tax law took effect, this is broadening out from the FedEx point just to the broader business community. Companies have spent almost 3 times as much on dividends and stock buybacks than they have on increased investment. If you actually look at the investment record, it is Exhibit A against the argument that the tax cut was going to have these trickle-down effects that would generate faster investment, faster productivity, and then faster income growth. In fact, in the prior 2 quarters, business investment has been a negative on GDP, and it is widely agreed upon that this is one of the most conspicuous failures. And that's what I mean when I talk about debt that I view as both wasteful, inequitable, and robbing the Treasury of revenues it needs to make the kinds of investments that we've been talking about earlier.
Dr. Blanchard?
Whatever the case for corporate tax rate reduction as boosting investment, I think the evidence so far is that it has not. And therefore, indeed, I think the money could have been spent much better along the lines that you suggested.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing. If I have learned anything with you over these 11 months now, it's that we should stop passing bills that are only supported by one party or the other. When Mr. Womack was chairman, we spent much of our time debating the merits of the Affordable Care Act and the unmet promises that were there, and now we're debating the merits of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. We're not debating the 83 Social Security amendments that raise taxes and cut benefits and solve the system for a generation. We're not debating the 96 welfare bill. We're not debating the 97 Medicare amendments. We're not debating the 2005 Medicare Part D, all of those things that we did in partnership. And against that backdrop, I ask, here we are with a 3-to-1 ratio, and yes, if Mr. Womack was chairman, we'd have a 3-to-1 ratio going the other way. I want to find what those things are we agree on, because the 3 of us had an opportunity to serve on a bipartisan, bicameral budget process reform committee last cycle, and I think I have heard that broad agreement that we can't keep doing things the way we're doing them, that we can do better. Even if we can keep doing things the way we're doing them, we can do better. In your testimony, Dr. Bernstein, you point out that non-defense discretionary spending isn't the problem. It absolutely, positively is not the problem. Now, we'll spend more time in Congress this year debating those issues than we will any of the problem issues, but it's not the problem. Dr. Blanchard, you said unless they're used to finance ambitious and credible public investment plans, deficits should be decreased. I serve on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. I promise you, we were supposed to debate ambitious and credible infrastructure development plans this year, and we haven't. We've been focused on other smaller issues. So what is the big picture item that across this panel we can agree on? And the plug I would put in would be a debt to GDP target that had enforceable mechanisms. It has to be revenue, it has to be dealing with mandatory spending growth, but that to bring people together, I've got to have a common set of rules and goals. If we all agree we can do better, tell me what that proposal is you would make, Dr. Bernstein.
Well, I think you said it. I'm not going to give you a number or a debt rule. What I'm going to say is that I think both sides agree that our infrastructure, our public infrastructure, is really in trouble. And I must say, I don't understand, especially given how low interest rates are, why we're not doing more investment in that. Maybe you can help me understand that. But that would seem to be an area of bipartisan agreement.
Now, given that everyone testified that they thought interest rates would remain low for some time to come, I thought we had a sense of urgency to get to work on taking advantage of low interest rates. I feel less of that sense of urgency listening to you all. I sometimes think we need that sense of urgency. If interest rates were 5, 6, 7% on federal debt, I promise you we wouldn't be having the debt conversation we're having now. We've made it too easy. Dr. Ray, you've been the target of a lot of conservative attention, but that also makes you someone who can help me bring my colleagues with me to the center. What's your counsel?
Well, we have to remember that the debt ratio is a compound term. And if we increase GDP and if we get growth going, the debt ratio will come down in two ways. High growth increases tax revenue tremendously. It reduces some kinds of transfer payments, so total spending goes down. And second, so the deficit is smaller. And second, we're increasing the denominator. GDP is higher. And that's the best way to reduce the debt ratio. And that is typically what has happened in the past. Our debt ratio was 100% in World War II. And then it declined over the whole post-war period until relatively recently when it started going back up again to 80%.
I was looking through each of your written testimonies, looking for that dramatic change in productivity, women entering the workforce, all of those dramatic factors that led to economic growth over the past 50 years. I didn't see any of those transformative things, which have me worried about repeating that. Even at these high consumption, our debt is not fueling the investment we've talked about. It is fueling consumption. It is fueling transfer payments. Even at these levels, you believe that we can only deal with one side of the equation, which is growing GDP. Love to grow GDP. I just don't think I'm a growth guy. I can't do it by growth alone. I've got to have revenue. I've got to have reductions in spending. Do you disagree with that fundamentally?
I don't think we need reductions of spending, no.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bernstein, you mentioned the offsetting costs of climate change. What did you mean by that?
I could cite various studies that project the costs of climate change in terms of destruction of property, destruction of businesses, destruction of homes, but I don't have to cite studies. You can just open the newspaper. We see much more volatile weather that scientists tell you is related to climate change, droughts, fires. That's what I was referring to. If we're going to contemplate the cost of doing something about that on the budget side, we must net out the costs of not doing something about it, which are in the hundreds of billions, according to estimates I've seen.
Thank you. In terms of fiscal responsibility, they'd say we should run the federal budget like families run their budgets. Isn't it true that a fiscally responsible family will routinely go into debt buying a house, buying a car, and sending children to college? What are comparable good debt on the government's behalf?
I think the analogy that the government is like a family is extremely misguided in this regard. In fact, it goes the other way. When families are tightening their belts, say in a downturn, the federal government, which has the ability to borrow, and again, particularly at low rates, should be loosening their belts. So the idea that the federal government would contract when the private sector is contracting is a recipe for austerity, more specifically for more pain for the people least insulated from the pain, the most economically vulnerable families.
But families do go into debt for houses. That's not considered fiscally irresponsible.
No, I mean, I think that's a good example of the kinds of debt distinctions that I'm making. I mean, people will go into debt for a college education, for a housing. It really gets back to this idea that growth rate versus the interest rate. And that applies to families too. Why does a college education often make sense to people? Because say a college loan often makes sense to people because you're becoming indebted in the interest of improving your earning power. And so that's the kind of calculation that I think families make, and governments ought to as well.
Now, it's been pointed out that there was no noticeable difference in trajectory in unemployment rate and jobs created after the $1.5 trillion tax cut, an economic plan about twice as expensive as the Obama stimulus package, which had a profound change in trajectory in terms of jobs and unemployment rate. Why was the Trump initiative so ineffective?
Well, first of all, I've noticed many members citing $1.5 trillion cost of the the CBO says 1.9, and that I think is more accurate.
I think it's a question of whether you add the interest in. I think is a question.
My answer to your question actually comes to predictions that not just myself, but were widely made before the Trump tax cuts, that it would not have anything like the investment effects that were projected. And the reason why many of us thought that was because the cost of capital was already so low, and that firms were sitting on large piles of retained earnings. So there was no reason to think that, as an economist would say, there was a large elasticity to tap there. That is, firms had access to all the investment capital they needed. We made it a bunch cheaper by cutting taxes, and guess what? They didn't respond on the investment side. Once again, supply side, trickle down, fairy dust didn't work.
You mentioned foreign held debt went from 2% to 30% of GDP. What's the problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is that more of our national income leaks out to lenders from abroad. So if you're concerned about one of the costs of increasing debt, meaning that income that we produce in this country ends up in the pockets of lenders from other countries, that's a germane concern at 30%, not so much at 2%.
And interest rates are set on we talk about crowd out, and we used to be concerned about the federal deficit. Are interest rates set on a domestic basis or an international basis?
I would say very much on an international basis, but I would also stress that the Federal Reserve or the central bank, and not just our central bank, are very much in the mix. And as I point out in my testimony, if you average out over the last decade, the central bank's interest rate has been 0.6% on average. So they're in the mix as well.
And if the international rate went up, an international rate over which we have very little control, what would happen?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I argue deficits matter, because we are exposed with a larger stock of debt to that kind of problem.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm thankful today in the House Budget Committee that we're actually talking about taxpayer debt for the first time. I've been here a little over 1 year, and it's the first time we've talked about it. It's encouraging. But I'm also discouraged to hear that, that we don't think that deficits and debts matter when we talk about the modern monetary theory, and that countries that can print their own money can just take care of their issues, and we don't really have a responsibility. Last week, we had the opportunity to talk to the Fed Chairman, Jerome Powell, sitting in your seat, and I asked him specifically about the modern monetary theory. And he stated, quote, "The idea that countries that borrow in their own currency can't get into trouble is just wrong. And the idea that debt does not matter is also wrong," end quote. Additionally, we have more than 40 leading economists were asked whether they agree with the underlying tenets of modern monetary theory by the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. 100% of the respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed with the economic principle. I don't believe that members of Congress are naive enough to believe in MMT as a way of servicing our debt. I believe that this is just a way to justify their multi-trillion-dollar wish list. They simply cannot face up to the reality that their free proposals like the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, the Green Housing Deal are not at all free. When asked about how to pay for these programs, they can't give a straight answer. Some just argue that we will. Some settle on the convenient MMT. This is not realistic. The Green New Deal, Medicare for All, and the Green Housing Deal are not realistic, and our kids and grandkids will pay the price tag. By pretending that we can afford these outrageous proposals, we're indebting our future generations to pay for them all. We've all talked about the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act of being just so destroying of our economy. Would you all agree that this year we'll have the highest revenues in the history of this country?
Not nearly as a share of GDP, which in my view is the right way to measure it.
But from a pure dollar standpoint, we'll have the highest revenues ever in the history of this country. Is that correct? It's a yes or no. I mean, it's not hard. You guys are economists, all doctorates, the last time I checked.
That statement is probably true every quarter in our history, except when we're in recession. The relevant measure is as a share of GDP. I mean, this is not a partisan statement. This is a CBO view. And as a share of GDP, we're collecting 16.3% of revenues in FY19. That's a historical low point.
So you know what, I've been here 1 year, what I would tell you that no matter what the revenue is, that we'll figure out how to spend it. I mean, would you agree with that as well? Okay, good. We got a yes or no on that one for sure. Yes, we will figure out how to spend it. There is no sense of fiscal accountability in this House. And so to say that it's wrong to put a little bit of money back in the people's pocket,
Because I will tell you, back in the hinterland, when you get out of the Beltway, they don't believe we can control any kind of spending. And to put money back in their pocket is not wrong, because they don't just go bury it in their backyard, contrary to what you'd like to make everybody believe. They go spend it in their economies, their local economies, which pay taxes to fund their schools, to fund their roads, to fund everything else in their area, not dependent upon the federal government. Those are just facts. You can agree or disagree, but those are facts. You know, as we go forward here, I like what you said, Mr. Bernstein, about we have good debt and bad debt. In fact, I introduced a pro-growth budgeting act 2 weeks ago. It will never see the light of day because, contrary to popular belief, most people here don't believe that you actually invest using debt. And when we talk to the ordinary people in the world, the people that are not in this room, except for our guests, appreciate our guests being here, but those of us that are here talking at each other, when you talk about debt, you have some reasonable expectation of paying it back. That does not occur in Congress. You borrow money and you never pay it back. It's only been paid back 4 years in a row, 97, 8, 9, and 2000. In 2001, a little bit. But since then, we've been running deficits every year, which means we're not paying down any debt. So we have a different definition of debt in this world up here. So I'd encourage you to look at that and give me your thoughts, because it says if we spend $1 or borrow $1, it's being borrowed and spent to actually grow the economy. I would encourage you to look at it. It's got a lot of reviews. A lot of people signed on to it. Not members of Congress, but a lot of people signed on to it. So anyway, I'd like to take a look at that. You know, as we go forward here, I'd like to talk about the Green New Deal, Mr. Ray. If it's not 93 trillion or 83 trillion, what is the number that we're talking about? Because it's getting used a lot around here. I know you guys, you see this and you hear about it and it's in the press, but in our hearings, every committee, 22 committees, has some component of a conversation of Green New Deal. Can you give me just your best guesstimate of what that's going to cost? Net. I get it, you know, you're going to save money and all that stuff, Mr. Taylor and others, but what is that number?
As I said, it depends on what you include in the Green New Deal, and it could be about 5% of GDP.
So only $100 billion a year? Is that what you're saying? Is that roughly? Wow. $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year. So trillion versus 9 trillion. That's a big difference. I mean, because up until now, I've not really heard many people argue the 9.3 trillion a year number.
Yes.
That. So
I have looked at the 93 trillion number, which is an outlier, and they don't count reduction of spending on, say, the destructive activities.
So you're saying that the 8.3 trillion is what we would save versus spending only a net trillion. That's, man, I don't know, that's a pretty good return.
Well, as I said, that was an outlier.
Yeah.
Other estimates are nowhere near that number.
Obviously, we don't have 20 minutes to ask questions. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your
I always
indulgence.
enjoy giving you more time.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. Thank the witnesses for being here.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the distinguished panel. I want to welcome Professor Taylor, who's from the Bay Area. I taught as a lecturer in economics at Stanford for 4 years. And while I'm more with Professor Krugman than I am with you, Professor Taylor, I will say that I had students in my class who wore a T-shirt with your face on it and the Taylor rule. So you certainly were a popular professor. I want to ask the panel about our strategy that allowed us to win the Cold War. I think we forget that post-Sputnik, our government did great things. We created satellites. We remain the only country that has ever sent someone to the moon. We invented the internet. We invented navigation systems. And I would argue that there were 2 comparative advantages to American policy. One, we had a policy of talent acquisition from around the world. If you were creative, smart, entrepreneurial, we wanted you here. And 2, we had almost 3% of our GDP in fundamental science and technology investment. And so I'd like to ask the panel, putting aside partisanship, if we want to lead the 21st century against China, would you recommend, as a growth strategy, that we invest in smart infrastructure, smart broadband, smart new technologies, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, new fields of biology? And would you recommend that we have a policy of talent acquisition? Dr. Bernstein or Dr. Taylor, either.
So, thank you, fellow professor.
Lecturer. I never would be tenured at Stanford.
So I think you're correct that what we did is in technology is amazing. The Apollo 11 movie is just a fantastic thing to watch. I encourage everybody to do that. It's the private sector, public sector working together, and I think that's admirable. I think we need to find out more ways to do that. I think it's partly working with the private sector. It's encouraged them. You know the private sector very well. And it's not bashing them, it's encouraging them because it's very much part of our society and why we're successful. I do think the question of crowding out of discretionary spending, which you're talking about, is other kinds of spending. I can see these projections of spending as a share of GDP, they're just going through the roof. And that means that other things which haven't even come up yet in this hearing are growing very rapidly because we know that funding for the things you're talking about are not going. So I think the focus should be, what are you going to do to control the growth of those items? Because they are crowding out the things that you want and we want. That's what's happening, and it's not really benefiting people very much. So that's where I would look. Why is that spending path exploding? It's exploding. What can you do about that? What can this budget committee do about it? It's partly the targets that Mr. Woodall suggested. What should maybe 42% of GDP, like we had averaged over 50 years, is okay. What's wrong with that? And then have a deliberative process of how do you get to that. So I would suggest having an overall view would be very important.
Dr. Bernstein, do you want to?
Very quickly, I would say that I wouldn't characterize our spending in the areas that John did as exploding. I would characterize them as completely predictable given pressures from demographics and healthcare costs, and I do think there are savings to be had there in healthcare reform. To answer let me just give you one granular answer to your question, and I know, Congressman, I think this will appeal to you because I know that you think about this in a granular way. So green technology wasn't on your list, but I'm sure it was implicit. And think about battery storage. Now, I happen to know that, I pay attention to this, countries are now trying to figure out, kind of competing, fighting for who's going to dominate the global market when it comes to storing energy in battery technology. And that's a fight that we're not even in. And I think it's extremely consistent with your view.
Right. If I could ask one more quick question of the panel. Putting aside your view on the wealth tax, I ran around across the statistic that 87% of American wealth is in the United States, 87%. Only 2% is in the Cayman Islands, 1.5% in Britain, 13% overseas. And so people who say, okay, if you have a tax on wealth, people are going to leave, remind me of my friends who said if Donald Trump was going to win the presidency, they would leave America. They didn't, because this is the best place to live in the world. And don't you think this is the best place still to invest in the world?
That's a rhetorical question. Yes. Yes, I do, and I think you make an interesting point that hasn't really been brought to bear on the wealth. I mean, I think it is true that given the mobility of wealth and proclivities for avoidance and evasion, we do need a structure that holds hands with other countries to monitor that. But your point is well taken.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here with us. So the federal government does have a serious spending problem, as do state governments, truly trying to be all things to all people. Even just hearing today, it sounds like he wants the government to get into the battery business. We don't so much have a revenue problem. According to CBO projections, the federal government's revenue will total $46 trillion over the next 10 years. Revenues will grow by 63%, about a 6% range. Very healthy. And last year, our revenues grew about 7%, and that's after the Tax Act, which had extraordinary results. However, mandatory spending over the next 10 years is projected to increase by $3.1 trillion to $5.3 trillion, a total of $36.5 trillion over a 10-year period, almost as much as it will be total as much as revenues. So without even discretionary, which will grow by $14 trillion, we've already used up, just in mandatory spending, all the revenue growth. So clearly, we have a spending problem, and that would put us in the neighborhood of a $10 trillion, 36 plus 14, deficit or debt, in addition to where we currently are. So, and this would lead to 79% of GDP today to 144% within a 10-year period. So the way I look at it is we have two budgets. We have discretionary and we have mandatory budgets. Discretionary spending is up $70 billion in 2018. Revenues, however, are also up $70 billion. So just looking at that one budget, we have a balanced budget. Our problem is, as stated, with mandatory spending. So what we have, though, is many proposals to add to our mandatory spending, such as Medicare for All, which has a $32 trillion estimate cost over the next 10 years. So, Dr. Taylor, I'll ask you, I'll start with you. In your opinion, how do you think the government would have to finance this program, and how high would taxes have to be raised to meet such a large level of additional mandatory spending?
I think if it's just an addition, it's not going to work. You have to do the other direction. The simulations, the calculations, as you say, this mandatory spending is going very rapidly. It's got to be controlled. You don't have to reduce it. You have to slow the growth compared to growth of GDP. There's proposals out to do that. I think there'd be more discussion of those proposals would be very worthwhile. Much of the discussions go into the opposite direction, Green New Deal, et cetera. Medicare for All, I haven't seen those where they're really saving money. I know there's some people that argued it would be, but there really has to be some attention given to this. The projections at least are explosions of spending, and it's largely because of the so-called entitlement program.
Has there ever been a country that you can think of in history that has spent its way into prosperity and increased taxes in order to pay for more government-run programs?
I think the history is quite clear that a solid fiscal policy where you're balancing the budget as close as possible over the cycle. You have deficits in recessions and slumps. You have even surpluses sometimes, and good times it works pretty well. It's worked well for the United States. When we got off of that, it has not worked very well. So that should be the goal. We're a long way for that now, but some of the reforms that would go in that direction. I would actually encourage you to use CBO. Why doesn't CBO have a model that answers the questions about the short run, the long run? Much of the debates and the focus is, oh, you can't even reduce the growth of spending because it's going to be a hit to the economy. I don't believe that's the case. I think you can, and reasonable calculations and models show that it's a benefit. So I would encourage that part. Maybe deals with some of the partisanship that we're seeing already.
Yes, agreed. I want to ask you this then. The tax cuts that took place, they're being debated. They're saying they were not helpful, and clearly we have an unbelievably booming economy, and are being compared to the shovel-ready stimulus program from 10 years ago, which the data shows was relatively useless and a waste. Can you just comment on the historical results that come from tax cuts, putting money in people's pockets and gaining the multiplier effect versus the federal government thinks it knows best with people's money and on projects that are so-called shovel-ready and are presented based upon very often who knows who, and which is also a symptom of a socialist government?
Thank you very much. I've written a lot on the stimulus packages, both in 2008 and later. The stimulus packages with President Obama. I don't think they had the impact that some people do. I think it actually was negative in many respects. The states didn't spend the money as they thought they would. They pocketed the money. A lot of it was transfers. It really didn't work very well. I mean, I have lots of studies that show that's the case. I also am on the record for showing and arguing that the 2017 tax reduction reform was beneficial, and it's not just the 35 to 21%. It's a lower rate on small businesses. It's expensing of investment. It's the kind of things that we know, at least in our theories, And I think it's true in reality that more investment, more tools, better things that workers have to work with, they're going to be more productive and their wages will go. That's the idea, and that's what's built into the CBO long-term calculations that I referred to before. So I don't think economics has changed. I think it's basically working quite well. We can see anomalies like the low interest rates that we've seen, but negative interest rates around the world. But basic economic forces are still working very well, and I think we need to emphasize those more.
I apologize for going over my time, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I keep hearing about the Green New Deal. It's a straw man. Fewer than half the Democrats have sponsored it. It's already been killed in the Senate. So I don't think we should spend a lot of time talking about it. I mean, there are component parts of it that have to deal with climate that I certainly think would be worth talking about, but it's become just a straw man, and it seems to end the discussion and not lead to much nuance. With respect to nuance, I get the sense that that there's kind of a consensus that it might be appropriate to debt finance the kinds of things that would generate a return. So that might be infrastructure, training, investment, education for people who could add to their earning potential, basic research. Of course, we did not develop GPS through the government. We did not develop the internet, but we led the research that allowed the private sector to invest in those things. And I think it certainly was good for the country and good for the United States to be the locus of that, I think, as well, as I think your other statement implied. But I do want to talk a little bit about bad debt, and I suspect that bad debt, and maybe Mr. Bernstein, you could answer this, might be financing or borrowing money to pay your ongoing expenses, whether it's particularly the ones that are non-cyclical. So if you think about the social benefit programs, I mean, is this something that we should be concerned about? Is it appropriate? Is that what you mean by bad debt?
You know, it isn't. And
what is an example of bad debt then?
Well, I think that, so I keep raising the tax cuts from my perspective. We don't have to rehearse that. There's another one, though, that I haven't had a chance to talk about, and it gets to something you were just raising, which is, you know, the fact that other countries insure their full populations for about 10 or 12% of their GDP, and we do so for 18% of our GDP. So call that 6 to 8% of GDP that is, you know, basically waste in the delivery system of the way we provide healthcare. So I think we could slow the cost of healthcare growth. Getting back to your first question, though, I'd want to do so in a way that protects vulnerable people.
Okay, so would you think it's appropriate for us to debt finance the cost of healthcare?
Oh, well, we very much do so, of course, and yeah, I mean, I think these are I mean, whether it's healthcare or retirement security through Social Security, I mean, these are clearly essential public goods, and we're not raising enough revenue to pay for them. So yeah, I consider that to be reasonable debt in this climate.
Oh, okay, I haven't found an answer yet, I don't think, but I'll ask Mr. Taylor. You advocate for the 2017 tax cut. Should we be cutting taxes more?
I think we should be looking for tax reform that promotes more economic growth.
So
it also deals with other problems, but I think it's still an important issue for the United States.
The knock on that bill was that, not that it didn't help some people, but that it helped a lot of people who didn't need help. And that if you give money back to people who already have swollen bank accounts and have a lot of savings, it's not going to generate the kind of economic activity. And in fact, all the economists surveyed by the University of Chicago, I think 38 of them, agreed that it wouldn't pay for itself. And I think even Mr. McConnell admitted we had to generate 4% growth in the economy to pay for those tax cuts. My question, I guess, is rhetorical, is where does this end? And if our revenues are at a low point compared to GDP, isn't it really time to think about how to get more revenue in? And maybe should wealthy people pay more, the ones who have plenty of earnings to part with?
I think it's time to, if there's
maybe more directly, what would you do for American tax policy? What would be your next step to make sure we have
consider more ways to reform? There was very little done on the personal side. There could be done more on that. There's the tax cuts are not permanent anyway. They're going to disappear. They, again, based on the basic economic theory, you want to have more encouragement of investment because that's where more productivity comes from.
Right.
More productivity leads to higher wages and higher incomes. It's just sort of the most basic thing in economics. You don't want to discourage businesses from investing. We want to encourage them because that will make their workers more productive in the system, as it has for many, many years.
If you acknowledge we should tax people at some level, how would I, as a policymaker, determine what that level should be?
I think the first thing is, what do you want your spending level to be? And there's not a discussion about that, and then you have a way to finance that. I think there's reasons that sometimes
Assume I wanted my spending level to be what it is today, which is $1 trillion more than we're taking in. What would I do to raise that
I think
money?
the projections of spending are that it's going, 28% of GDP is the projections.
Well,
so that's not going to work. So
Assume
you have to do.
Assume it's 20%, and right now I'm taking in 16%. What should I do to tax policy to raise that money?
I think the tax cut that's in place will raise more. This notion that it's not paying for itself is not really true if you look over the long term. It's true over maybe a couple years or 3 years, but it's not true over the longer term. Growth increases. You don't have to be.
I'm out of time, but maybe I'd ask you in writing. Like if I say 20% is a historical level at which we invest, and we're taxing at 16%.
The budget committee, the Congress has to decide what's the right level.
Well, I'm not a professor at Stanford. That's why I asked you a question about how I would answer that question. I mean, we're all people of good faith who want to figure out what the right answer is, but I never hear from people what the appropriate way to set that number is, and it strikes me that some people are being undertaxed, and they're not the people who are paying payroll taxes. So I guess we'll have a continued discussion later, but I would really like to know the answer to that question.
Can I submit a memo on that to you?
Absolutely, you may. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes. Oh, I'm sorry, no, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm really enjoying these. Thanks to the witnesses, by the way, for being here. I'm enjoying these conversations today. We're talking about the unsustainability of the federal debt, and yet this committee that is responsible for producing a budget to address our spending has not done one. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to submit to you that we got to get back on track on this committee and produce a budget. That's our primary responsibility. The federal debt is an unsustainable trajectory. We all know that. The current debt burden on every American is $70,000. Within 3 decades, CBO says that it's going to be around $248,000 per American, or almost $1 million for a family of 4. So mandatory spending, including interest payments on the debt, is projected to increase from $3.1 trillion in fiscal year 19 to $5.3 trillion in fiscal year 29. This is a $2.2 trillion or 71% increase. So, Mr. Taylor, do you believe we should be focused on stabilizing current important programs such as Social Security and Medicare, which we know those are part of the mandatory spending that's driving the debt, right? So that we can make sure that they are preserved and strengthened? Or should we focus on expanding these programs and creating a bunch of new programs on top of them?
I think the most important thing is to stabilize in the sense of have them not growing faster than GDP. And that requires reform, and that requires projections, and I think they will work better in that case. I think there could be more focus on this committee, other committees of Congress, on finding ways to reform those programs. That's what I would focus on. They are crowding out other things that have been mentioned already in this room. And then once that is determined, that's the job of our society, our democracy, to determine that, then figure out about the financing. And there are reasons why sometimes you have deficits and sometimes you have surpluses. Economists have wrote about that all the time. But I think the main thing is what should be the spending priorities, And I believe now that it's the so-called entitlements are growing too rapidly. Many people have thought that the same, so figure a way to reform that. There are proposals out there, and that's the way I would go about it.
Yeah, and use that ugly word, entitlements, because I can tell you the people where I live, where I represent, my 80-something-year-old mother, before she passed away, they hate that word entitlements because they invested in those programs. They view those programs as responsibilities of the federal government, and we've let them down by not doing budgets, by not managing the spending so that we protect those programs. You know, interest payments on the debt are already high. And are projected to grow. This year, interest on the debt is projected to be $390 billion. By 29, it will more than double to $807 billion. Under CBO's longer range forecast, interest on the debt will rise to 29% of federal revenue by 2049. So again, Mr. Taylor, are you concerned that an ever-rising federal debt and its associated interest payments will crowd out other important federal spending priorities, such as defense, research, health care, and meeting our obligations that American people have paid into?
Absolutely, I am concerned. That's why I focused in my testimony of the costs of doing that. I think it's a cost to the economy. CBO agrees it's a long-term cost. I think it's also a short-term cost, and would encourage CBO to adjust their analysis to capture that as well. But it's fundamental. It's really the most important thing that I look at the budget. I don't know why it's going in the direction it's going. Need to change it. Need to make it more sense from an economic perspective.
Okay, in my last 30 seconds, you know, some would say that modern monetary theory simply says that Americans shouldn't worry about how much we spend because the dollar is the currency of the world, and because America owns the dollar, we just print it when we want it. So my question to you is, do you worry that implementing this kind of philosophy, the MMT, could cause a loss of confidence in U.S. financial markets?
Yeah, I'm worried about it for a number of reasons. It's really going back to policies that we know haven't worked in the U.S. I gave my example of the 1970s, but it's going back to countries which have not been successful. It's high inflation. I would like to see at least somebody run through particular proposals that are along these lines with some models, with the CBO models, so there can be some at least discussion about it. But right now, it seems to me it's going back to policies which we know in history have not worked.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Tchaikovsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go back to climate for a minute. I think it's perhaps the greatest challenge facing the 21st century. We have just, it's estimated, 11 years to cut emissions by 45%, have to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 to stop temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees centigrade. But creating a clean creating a clean economy will require sustained government investment. We've heard you talk about that. And in a Roosevelt Institute report, economists J.W. Mason and Mark Park argue that the government can't afford to finance decarbonization plans of at least 5% of GDP, as you mentioned, Dr. Ray, without causing substantial economic disruption. So, Mr. Bernstein and whoever else wants to comment on this, given our current economic conditions of persistently low interest rates, as you had mentioned before, and low inflation rates, would you agree that it is sound fiscal policy for the government to invest in a clean economy? And let me also ask, would you also agree that the economic and social costs of not addressing climate change are far greater than any risk to incurring additional debt?
I'll be brief. I'd like to hear my other panelists
Sure.
comment on this.
Thank you.
Yes, as I've stated throughout the hearing today, we can't make this a one-sided equation. As you correctly point out, Congresswoman, we have to factor in the cost of the environmental damage from doing nothing. And if you simply look at your front page, those costs seem to be growing by the month. And I guess my argument would be we can't afford not to do this, and to talk about this purely as an expense on businesses or something like that is to miss both the opportunity for game-changing investments where I believe our country should play a role, and again, the costs of not doing enough.
Yes, Dr. Blanchard?
There is a marvelous cartoon. It takes place in 2050. The world has become inhabitable. But there is an old man who talks to a young man, and he says, yes, it is inhabitable, but look, we've reduced the debt. I think that's a very deep...
Bad choice.
It is clear that we need to do something about global warming, that the cost will be high. The question, I think, is not whether it should be done. It should be done. The question is how much should be financed through taxation, additional taxation, and how much should be financed by debt. I don't think there's a simple 0-1 answer to that. Some of it can be financed by debt, but to a large extent, what we do to fight global warming has very large social returns, but very low financial returns to the state. And therefore, if it's all financed by debt, it will complicate life later for the state. So I think it's a mix, but there's no question that we should be doing it, and partly finance it by tax and partly financing by debt. The part which would be financed by debt would be called, I think, by Jared, good debt. This is debt to improve the future.
Dr. Ray?
Yeah, can I add? Look, according to the scientists, and I'm not one of those, we have the technical know-how, okay? So the question is, can we release the resources from current uses plus put unemployed resources to work to tackle climate change? And I think the answer is clearly yes. If it's 5% of GDP and use that as a measure of the resources we need, this is absolutely doable. Think about what we did in World War II. We had to move 50% of the nation's production to fight the war. We did it. The debt ratio went to 100%. The deficit reached as high as 25%. We managed to keep inflation below 10% at the peak, and most of the years much below that. We can, if necessary, I completely agree with Professor Blanchard, we may find we're going to need a tax increase, or we may find that we need to postpone some consumption, to ask the workers to make a sacrifice for 10 years in order to enact what we need to do to turn around this trajectory of annihilation. And we'll reward you later. That's what we did in World War II. We gave benefits, Social Security, retirement, health care, all those things were promised at the end of the war. Workers got them. How did we come out of that experience with a 100% debt ratio? The golden age of US capitalism. That's what we got from that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to clarify some things because there's been some creative use of semantics about the debt. So over and over again, we hear that we aren't taking enough money from the American people and the businesses that they create. If we let them keep their money, it's apparently classified as bad debt for the government, which is quite the take. Dr. Bernstein, as you stated, apparently Americans spending more of their money because of the tax cuts is not useful investment. Never mind that GDP growth rates have increased since the tax cuts, and according to the Fed and CBO, it has been largely due to consumer spending and some business investment. But I guess that isn't useful because there is this belief, and it is a belief, that only the government can possibly make smart investments. This is an odd thought, this notion that our debt is a result of not taking enough of our constituents' money, as opposed to us spending it on unsustainable entitlement programs, which, by the way, as a share of GDP, is the only category that is changing radically. So federal revenue in absolute terms has continued to increase by 4% last year. And as a share of GDP, it dropped, as Dr. Bernstein has noted, only slightly recently, but it's on track, as this graph notes, it's on track to be back at historical levels within just a couple of years. So if we don't cherry pick the data, we see that we aren't that far from average federal revenue. What has happened in the last couple of years? The fastest growing wages have been in the bottom quintile of earners, and it's not even close. Child tax credits have doubled, which matters to low-income earners. Businesses are hiring, which matters to all people, not just the 1%. 80% of taxpayers are paying less this year, and we all know that it is the wealthy earners in high-tax states who ended up paying more. Let's stop pretending otherwise. And this notion that we are regressive is interesting. Dr. Bernstein, how does our country compare to others in the OECD, as it pertains to progressivity of the tax code? Where does America stand?
Pretty low, not only in terms of progressivity, but also in terms of the amount of tax collection of the federal government.
Okay, well, the OECD data completely disagrees. In fact, they have us at number one.
So that's including state and local. You can't do anything about state and local.
That includes all taxes?
Yeah, you can't do anything about state and local.
So we're number one.
Federal taxes were made far more regressive by the tax cut. I mean, that's not a debatable.
But as a country, we are number one, and it's not even close. Ireland is second
Number
place.
one
It's
in
not
what?
even close. Progressivity of the tax code. Okay. Dr. Taylor, you said the tax cuts have been effective. And I'll give you this data, Dr. Bernstein, if you'd like, to add context to the discussion. Dr. Taylor, you said the tax cuts have been effective. A lot of others disagree with you, but how so? How have they been effective?
Well, first of all, they have had increase in growth since they were passed. Growth has been higher in 2017 and 2018. Towards the end of 2017, it was passed. It was passed relatively quickly. Nobody think it would happen, but I think it's been a beneficial thing. I think long run you'll see more effects. There's a slowdown now in the economy. It could be due to other things. Could be due to this growing debt, but I think ultimately it's beneficial. And that's what theories show, the models show, and the data show.
Thank you. And look, it doesn't actually seem like any of you are advocating for unlimited spending. That's not what I'm taking here. And I do believe, Dr. Bernstein, you said in your statement that we would be better off actually decreasing our deficits somewhat, not zeroing them out. That would be radical according to you, but you want to get them on a more sustainable path. That's what I remember reading from your statement. And so, Dr. Bernstein, here's what I want to ask you. What is the main driver of debt? Okay, you obviously do not want to touch discretionary spending, perhaps even increase it. But even if you had your way and you eliminated the recent tax cuts, it still wouldn't pay for the vast growth in entitlement programs. So I want to know, can we agree on this? Do we agree that Social Security and Medicare programs need to be addressed? And do we have solutions for that don't involve overtaxing my generation in order to increase benefits for your generation? And Dr. Taylor, if you could also answer this after Dr. Bernstein.
No, I think there's some agreement there. I think that where we disagree is on the revenue side. So you and your colleagues keep citing these highest revenue collections ever because you're talking billions and trillions. As I point out in my testimony,
I understand we disagree on that, but the main driver of debt, we do agree is entitlements, right? We do agree on that.
Yes.
So I want to get a solution for that.
So the solution,
drive the discussion towards that.
I've tried to emphasize. So there's two solutions to that. One is we need to collect more revenues and do so more progressively, and two, we need to slow the growth of healthcare spending.
Okay. And if the chairman would allow it, if Dr. Taylor would like to answer that as well.
No, I think it's clear that the driver is you use the word entitlement spending. That's okay with me. Is this growth, which is quite rapid, and a reform of those programs. A reform, I think, which will make them work better is what we need, and it's going to slow their growth, and that's what's key.
I'd love to talk about that for hours, but only if the chairman would indulge me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'd all have to do that. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today, as well as your expertise on this very, very important, crucial subject. I believe that you've testified to. I apologize for not being here earlier, and so I probably will ask some questions that have already been asked, so let me just make that clear. But thank you very much for being here. We are here, as you know, to re-examine the economic costs of our debt, and obviously before we do that, though, we want to take the stock level of debt we have and the trajectory of our deficits and our debt. As you know, we got $16 trillion in publicly held debt and $6 trillion in intergovernmental debt. Basically, we're close to, the debt surpassed $23 trillion, and it's growing faster than our GDP. And Dr. Blanchard, you testified that deficits running at 5% of GDP are a cause for concern. Debt as a share of GDP is projected to rise from 79% in fiscal year 2019, 95% by fiscal year 2029, and if we keep on going at this rate, it's going to be 144% by 2049. Now, last week, at the very same table that you gentlemen are sitting at, the Federal Reserve Chairman said that the level of debt that we currently are going at is just completely unsustainable. And I believe he's right. But regardless of that level and which level is healthy, there are clear dangers, I think we understand, of allowing our debt to continue to grow at this rate. And so clearly your testimony today is very important, not just to examine those risks, but to also look forward to some sort of solutions to responsible and smart budgeting. If I may, Dr. Blanchard, you're closest to me. Do you have an opinion as to what a healthy debt to GDP ratio is? And does 100% concern you? If not, what about that 144% number I threw out there?
I believe that there is no magic number, that could increase to a much higher level before starting or triggering a crisis in the markets. This being said, there is no particular reason to want to do it because it can be done. And therefore, other things equal, I think that lower levels of debt than the ones we have are desirable. And that if we can get there without creating problems with the economy itself by slowing down public demand, I think we should try to get there.
Understood. Now, I wasn't here for your testimony, but I read your testimony, and you said that the deficit shouldn't keep us from making smart investments, clearly. But if we run deficits without considering the debt at all, we clearly run some risk, correct?
Yes, when you want to issue debt only for good reasons. One, maybe to sustain basically the demand and maintain output at full employment, or for public investment, which makes sense. If you don't do this, neither of the two, then you should definitely worry about debt. If you do this, I worry less about an increase in debt if I can justify it on the basis of either macro considerations or public investment.
Understood. Okay, thank you. And Dr. Bernstein, you were, in your testimony that I read, you talked about the 2017 tax bill, obviously, and the drain that it had on revenue. Is there anywhere else that you would suggest we look to increase revenue?
Yes, I think it's an important question. Because so much of market income and market wealth has accumulated at the top of the scale, I think that some of the current debates about taxing wealth are relevant and worth thinking more about. Now, whether we're actually talking about a wealth tax is a different question. So closing the step-up basis loophole would make a lot of sense to me.
Could you explain that briefly?
Sure. So when a wealthy person transfers a capital gain to an heir, the value or the basis of that capital is stepped up, meaning it's raised to the current market rate, and that gain is completely untaxed. So this is a way in which asset accumulation it goes untaxed. And the more you put wealth or income or any sort of accumulation in a tax category that goes untaxed, the more people are going to figure out that's precisely the kind of income they have a lot of. So I'm not necessarily endorsing some of the more far-out ideas about new wealth taxes. I'm saying we should tighten up what we have. We should bring capital gains rate closer to income rates. We should give the estate tax some bite, and we should definitely fund the IRS to close some of the tax avoidance gap that's cost us literally hundreds of billions per year.
Great, thank you. I yield back my time. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the ranking member for 10 minutes.
And we're into the lunch hour, which is never a good thing for the two of us who have a few minutes of questions. First of all, thanks to the witnesses here today. Going to come full circle and just ask each of them. We kind of started this way. I want to go back because there's been a lot said. Does debt matter? From the perspective of the United States taxpayer who may be watching this hearing or hearing about it, to each of my panelists today, Does the federal debt matter? Dr. Blanchard.
That absolutely matters.
Dr. Ray.
That was a but I didn't give me time.
We may come back to the but.
Yes, but probably not in the way you're implying.
You said but and kept going, and I wouldn't let Dr. Blanchard do it.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. My dad always said, don't go into debt. He's a very successful businessman. Don't go into debt for things that are not an appreciating asset. Pretty sage advice, don't you think?
Yes.
Do I get any pushback from the?
No, you said my but.
Yeah, okay. And I think he's right. And by the way, he operates a business today and has no debt, and has an extremely healthy business. There have been some discussions here today about whether the family household budget that most of our constituents have a context on versus the federal budget, and whether they should operate similarly when it regards debt. Now, the household budget does not have to provide for the national defense. It's not in their Constitution. It's in our Constitution. It's in the Constitution that we're responsible for up here. But in terms of going into debt for purposes of investment, growth in the economy, those kinds of things, the principles, though, between the household and the federal budget are still similar in nature. Would you not agree?
I would not agree. The public debt, the government debt, plays a macro stabilization role that individual debt does not. So when the government decreases its debt or has a large surplus, this has an adverse effect on the economy, which it has to take into account. This is irrelevant to you or me or any household.
Dr. Ray, I saw a negative response from you.
Right, because when you're looking at it from the point of view of the individual in the private sector, whether household or firm, at some point, yes, they need to repay their debt. The private sector taken as a whole never repays all of the debt. It grows over time. In the same way that the federal government's debt grows over time, it's been growing since 1791. It's been growing as relative to GDP since 1791. It will continue to grow. So will the private sector's total debt. So you can't look at it from the point of view of the individual in the private sector. Look at the private sector as a whole. Their debt grows over time, too.
All right, Dr. Bernstein?
Just as I said earlier, I think this idea that when the household is tightening their belt, the government actually needs to go in the other direction. So I'm afraid I disagree as well.
Dr. Taylor?
Just to be sure, I think these so-called automatic stabilizers are good. It's been the economy's in a boom, revenues increase and spending increases, and I think in a slump it goes the other way.
Well, I guess here's where I'm going with it, and that is that unlike the federal government, for the American household, there are consequences for going into too much debt to the extent where you do not have the capacity to repay. And there are many examples of that. Student loan debt, I think, is a real good poster child for it, because there's a lot of people that went into student loan debt with a purpose of improving their earnings potential when, in fact, they didn't improve their earnings potential. In fact, a quarter of that student loan debt is not even, did not even lead to a college degree. So I think it was purpose defeating in that regard. But there are consequences for my constituents for going into too much debt and not having the capacity to repay, as opposed to the U.S. government. Which leads me to this question. If we agree that debt does matter, and it's just a discussion about the type of debt, bad debt versus good debt, and if the premise that the government should have the capacity to repay, and I'm not talking about just minimum payment due, just the net interest on the debt, but I mean start whacking away at the long-term structural challenges. If that is true, then the lack of the congressional process that this guy and I worked on, in addition to Mr. Woodall, to develop a budget of the United States government and to be able to put before the American people what our fiscal condition is and to begin to make those prioritized decisions, discretionary, versus non-discretionary, and or the mandatory side. And remember, those mandatory programs are on autopilot, so unless the Congress acts, they continue to go completely unchecked. And it becomes a demographic challenge for the country that are moving those costs higher, in addition to healthcare spending that Dr. Bernstein, you talked about. So would you agree with me that part of the problem that Congress has is it is not honoring the process that is designed to be able to put the spotlight on the fiscal condition of our country in such a way that we can begin to make those established priorities? And again, not at the risk of using the word poster child again, let me remind you, yesterday we passed a continuing resolution. We are almost 8 weeks into the fiscal year. We don't have a budget, and we push the spending of the country again to the 20th of December, to Christmas, and we'll probably do it again, and maybe 2 or 3 more times, is the lack of the execution of our process, or a better process, contributing to the problems that we're facing today. Dr. Blanchard.
I would not think of myself as an expert on these issues, but yes, from where I stand at a distance, it looks like the congressional budget process is not ideal and could be substantially improved.
Dr. Ray? Or does the process matter?
Look, capacity to repay. I'm not sure what that would mean for a federal government that is an ongoing concern, that has only repaid its debt one time, 1837, followed by our first depression. We do not have to repay the debt. What we have to do is make the interest payments. That's what we need to do.
All right, so let me hit pause here a minute and just focus on interest payments for just a moment. Today, as evidenced by a couple of our members have indicated that the net interest on the debt this year with very low interest rates is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion, which is more than half of what we spend on our constitutional challenge to provide for the common defense of the country. And there's been the term crowding out used many times here today. We are crowding out the investments that you gentlemen are suggesting that we continue to make to grow our economy, help vulnerable Americans. The things that we would normally spend that money on, we're spending on the net interest on the debt. That's money that could be being spent elsewhere, which I think makes my point that deficits and debt do matter, because it is crowding out the available money that we have to be able to effectively fund the discretionary budget of the U.S. government.
Well, I mean, you put that constraint on yourselves, and I understand your political dilemma here. Interest payments, I think all three of us agree, are a very inefficient kind of spending. First, half of it's going abroad, okay, and the other half is going into the United States, but it doesn't tend to go where you want it to go. It doesn't tend to lead to economic growth. So I'm not advocating trying to ramp up interest payments. Crowding out theory, there are two approaches, one loanable funds, the other is ISLM. The evidence just does not show that there's crowding out. Now, it may crowd out your spending because you put constraints on the budgeting process. It doesn't crowd out in the real world by raising interest rates and reducing investment. All that government spending goes somewhere into the economy, and it creates net income for the private sector, which should encourage investment rather than discouraging investment.
So the constraints that you suggest that we put on ourselves are only there for one reason, and that is not to explode this deficit and debt situation even further, exacerbate the situation as we currently have, which most people would agree is already beyond any capacity for us to be able to repay, and it's just going to lead to further complications in taxes for future generations. Dr. Bernstein, real quickly, a thought from you, and then I'll come
just
to Dr.
on the process point, because what you said resonates with me. I'm going to be straight with you about that, about the broken process. But I immediately went back to, I believe it was 2011, and the balanced budget agreement that created this so-called super committee. I view that as being just a huge process failure. So
that was 2011.
Yeah, 2011.
Not our joint select committee.
No, I'm just saying.
Okay, all right.
I say that I think the problems go deeper than process. I agree with you the process is broken, but I think there are fundamental differences about the kinds of investments that we're arguing about today, good versus bad, about the amount of revenues that we need to collect. And I feel like before we can have a reasonable process, we probably have to talk more about those differences.
Dr. Taylor.
So I think going back to regular order would be tremendous. Budgets comes from the president, the budget committees go through it, the appropriations, and you got a budget by October 1st. It would just be so clear to people compared to what's happening now. No one, this is democracy, people are supposed to be somewhat informed. It would improve the process greatly. I would encourage you to try to do that.
Okay, and I've just got one final question, and it's related to our process because our committee, which I think did extraordinary work, we came up a little bit short, but not because we didn't really work hard at it, because we spent a year doing it. But the one thing that I think we kind of rallied behind was regarding debt is some kind of a target. We've talked about it already today, debt to GDP, which I believe, I've given up hope that we're going to balance the books of the federal government. It's certainly not in the time frame I'm going to be here, but at some point in time, should this country not have a reasonable target of debt to GDP? Pick the number. I don't know if it's 42, the historical average, or if it's 65, or use whatever that number is, but some kind of a target so that we can at least begin to somewhat conduct ourselves as people who can constrain the absolute growth of federal government, which can go out of sight if you don't. Real quickly, from left to right.
I think that the issue is that we really do not have a good sense of what the debt target is. And choosing a number comes with dangers of trying to do something which may not be quite the right thing. So I'm with you in spirit. I would have a very hard time deciding what the number should be.
Dr. Ray.
Absolutely agree. I can't see any, I think you should focus on the things that are important. Okay, employment, rising income, economic growth, rising productivity, meeting the challenges that face us in the future.
Dr. Bernstein.
Yeah, I would urge you to think about debt much more dynamically. Imagine we had a debt target in World War II, and we didn't gear up to fight that existential battle. I'm sure you would be opposed to that. So I don't think targets are a good idea.
Okay, Dr. Taylor.
I think targets are a good idea with emergency clauses to deal with this.
Amen. I yield back my time. Thanks for allowing me to go over.
Absolutely.
And congratulations on Louisville being number 2.
Thank you.
By the way.
We're loaded. People need to look out for us. I yield myself 10 minutes. Thanks again to all the witnesses for being here, and I think it has been a valuable discussion. I didn't have much economics education on my way through school, so I'm using my chairmanship to become educated, and this hearing helped. When Mr. Cooper earlier talked about nuances in some of these issues, and I fully agree that most everything we do up here has significant nuance, and we don't recognize that. So I'm interested, we talk about the 2017 tax cut. When people say it's a $1.9 trillion tax cut, it actually wasn't. It was a $5 trillion tax cut. Just that we're offsetting revenues that made it a $1.9 trillion net tax cut. So, and one of the biggest factors on the revenue side was the SALT taxes, eliminating the state and local tax deduction. There were many others. And so in terms of thinking about if we were to review the tax cut with an aim of keeping the parts that did benefit people and doing away with the part that had no societal benefit, I think that's an important distinction to make. When Mr. Smith talks about his residents, yeah, if you get a $100 tax cut and you're making $40,000 a year or something less than that, that's a significant amount. When you're my classmate in college, Stephen Schwarzman, and you talk about cutting his tax rate by 2.6% at the top, that doesn't seem to serve any great societal benefit. So I think we often have to think about taxes like that. And I also think about, when we talk about cutting mandatory spending, whatever we spend on Social Security, every Social Security benefit check that goes out every month, how much of that do you estimate goes back into the economy?
Vast majority.
Virtually all of it, right? And whatever we spend on Medicare and Medicaid goes back into the economy. So our whatever it is, $4.5 trillion spending at the federal level, with the exception of probably some of the defense budget and the interest on the debt, all is part of GDP. So when we're talking about cutting federal spending, we are cutting GDP at the same time. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes, like all of a sudden we just cut this and the economy keeps roaring on. That's not necessarily the case. Humana is based in my district. Humana is right now about a $60 billion a year company. 80% of their revenue is managing government health care programs. So you cut health care there, you're cutting a huge part of my economy in my district. And so, again, these things are all very, very nuanced. Is there any difference, in your opinion, anybody can answer this, a tax cut that goes to a middle-income individual versus their Social Security check in terms of macroeconomic impact? Is there any difference?
No, I think the likelihood is that they'll both be spent.
Right. So in one case, you're dropping federal revenues, the other one's just writing a check, but they have the same impact on the economy. And one of the things that I love about your statement, and it came up when Dr. Taylor talked about looking at models from CBO. And I saw a little smirk on your face. I may have misread it, but when you talk about empirical economics, and that's where since I've been on this committee, which is now, this is my 11th year, is something that I've always been very interested in. I remember several years ago when Tim Geithner was Secretary of the Treasury and came before the committee, and at the time Paul Ryan was chairman of the committee, and he put up these charts showing spending on mandatory spending and so forth, and the debt going out 50 years. So I asked Secretary Geithner, how realistic do you think projections going over 50 years are? And he said, I don't think anything longer than 5 years is reliable. And that's one of the things that I've been obsessed with, is that we live in a world that is changing more rapidly than anyone can possibly have forecast, and making projections as to what's going to happen in the economy. I saw this morning there was a release of a story that a company that Bill Gates funded has come up with a process using artificial intelligence and solar panels that will allows you to create heat at levels sufficient to do concrete and so forth, which is responsible for about 7% of global carbon emissions. So it seems to me that the possibilities of technology and innovation radically changing some of our future needs, and maybe increasing some of our needs, is something that it's going to be hard for us to project. I always say Congress at its optimum efficiency moves at 10 miles an hour. This year it's 2 miles an hour, but the world's moving at 100, and I don't know how we make policy to accommodate that. But one of the things, Dr. Blanchard, that I've been obsessed with is artificial intelligence, and we know artificial intelligence is going to have its productive uses, as it apparently has with this company, but it's also going to have disruptive uses in the economy. For instance, eliminating an awful lot of jobs. I've heard one estimate that this came from one of the top people at IBM, who said that within the next 3 years alone, artificial intelligence would either eliminate or significantly change 120 million jobs around the world, and that's going to increase. So given that, we don't know the extent of disruption that's going to happen, but we know there's going to be a lot of disruption happening. What would you say that means for our priorities of spending in order to try to accommodate the changes we know will come, but we don't know to what extent?
I think AI has all kinds of implications. One of them is that the low productivity growth that we have might increase over time, because we're really discovering ways of doing things differently, in which case it would be good news for the economy. It would probably increase interest rates, but that's fine. I think the other dimension, which is worrying people very much, is that there might not be enough jobs. And as you know, this is an issue which has come with technological progress for at least 2 centuries. In the past, it has always worked out okay, in the sense that new jobs have been created. I think this time we're less sure. It may not, in which case we really have to think about everything we can do to help the people who may lose their jobs and not find one. This leads to issues of universal basic income, basically money given to people who really cannot find jobs. It means thinking again about the earned income tax credit and making it much more generous than it is. I think we have to be ready for these contingencies. They may cost money.
I'm going to not ask any more questions, but you all have sat here a long time and listened to a lot, so I'd like to give each of you a minute to respond to anything you heard. If there's something you'd like to comment on that you heard that you'd like to either defend yourself or to make another point. Dr. Taylor, you want to start?
So I think 3 things. Tax reform, if possible, should be revenue neutral. So that's the idea of this SALT changes. You had restrictions on the state and local taxing, and you had a reduction in the rates. So maybe that went too far for California or some states, but that's the concept is useful. I think it's not correct to say that every reduction in government purchases reduces GDP. If it's planned, if it's understood, if the context is there, if there's a social safety net which is reasonable, I think it can benefit. And that's what my simulations tried to show. You can actually have a higher GDP growth. And finally, the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs. I think the main lesson is let the private economy work. It's amazing what it can do, and that's why the history that Olivier Blanchard referred to is so promising. And the worst thing we can do is get in the way of what the market will do. Of course, you need to have a social safety net which is working, but don't really make a mess of what otherwise could be a tremendous boom to productivity, not only in the United States but globally.
Thank you. Dr. Bernstein?
I guess 2 points. One is, or maybe a point and a question. One is that we really do have a revenue problem. And I guess the one thing I would argue is that it really doesn't make sense to cite revenue collections in the billions and hundreds of billions and argue that we're in some uniquely favorable space. As a percentage of GDP, and I go through this in my testimony, if you can bear reading through it, I tried to do a careful job. The 2017 tax cut really broke down connective tissue between a growing economy and ample revenues, and I believe that it's essential that we fix that if we're going to address this problem. I guess the question I have is, often when I come up here and talk about these issues, I hear much more reasonable conversation, much more agreement, much more fundamental understanding of the importance of key investments in public goods, and yet at the other end of the process, we just don't see it. I'm a creature of the swamp here for decades, and I'm still scratching my head as to why well-intentioned people, not everybody's well-intentioned, but a lot of people I heard from today on both sides can't get together, especially given the favorable rates that we've all been stressing, and make some of these investments.
Well, I want to respond to that, because if you just let Yarmouth and me fix all this, give us 30 minutes and a sandwich.
Are you announcing that you're running for?
No, but we've had this conversation a lot.
Right.
I just want to say,
so
there were several references to MMT, and they all seem to equate it to printing money. That is not MMT. We describe the way the government actually spends. I think what they have in mind is something much closer to quantitative easing, in which the Fed spent $3-4 trillion buying assets, essentially by crediting bank accounts with reserves. That is nothing like what MMT is recommending. We are asking you to look at government debt deficits in a different way, to take account of sectoral balances. If you're going to reduce the budget deficit, we need to know which one of those other 2 sectoral balances is going to change. Are we going to be reducing the private sector's surplus? Are we going to make the private sector run deficits? Are we going to somehow get the trading partners to decide not to sell stuff to the United States? Something has to happen. You can't just raise the tax rate and think that you're going to balance the budget, or reduce government spending and think you're going to balance the budget, because one of those other two sectors, or both of them, has to change what they're doing. And cutting health costs is cutting GDP. Cutting government spending is reducing the injection of government spending into the economy. Reducing the amount of debt that is issued is also reducing the net financial assets that are being accumulated by the private sector. That's going to have some kind of consequences for the private sector. So we need to look at both sides of the equation of government spending, but also of government debt, which is held as an asset, the safest asset in the world. The world wants more of it. So why are we so worried about giving the world what they want? The last thing on the robots taking away all our jobs, as Professor Blanchard said, this has been going on for 200 years. It's usually a good thing. I think it probably will continue to be a good thing. But what should the government do about this? We do need training. We do need education. Because robots are pretty good at taking away the jobs of the lower skilled and lower educated workers. They're some way off from taking away our jobs. Maybe someday that will happen, but we need to worry about the people at the bottom end that will be replaced probably pretty quickly. We need to educate them. I don't like the idea of a basic income guarantee, or just telling people, look, sorry, in the modern economy, there's nothing that you can do. No, we have to find jobs for these people, and we need to train them for jobs.
I thank you for that. And, well, I'll go to Dr. Blanchard first.
Looking at my notes, 2 points. The first one is a nerdy one, which is that if you look at interest rates and debt, it's true that interest rates have decreased while debt was increasing. To conclude from this that therefore there is no effect of debt on interest rates would be wrong. This would be mixing correlation and causality. I think what has happened is many other factors have led to a decrease in interest rates, which have nothing to do with debt. It may well be that that still has a positive effect on rates. It just is hard to see because of all the other things which have happened. So I think we have to continue to assume that debt in the long run has some effect on interest rates. I think it would be dangerous to do something else. The other is more general and relate to a number of discussions which took place, which is I do not think that mandatory spending can be decreased substantially. I think there are some savings to be made, but there are also more demands because of aging and those dimensions of change. I very strongly suspect that the way to take care of deficits and reduce them over time is through increasing taxes. I have no doubt that this is the case.
Thank you. Just one comment. Watson, apparently, IBM's Watson can now apparently do 70% of what lawyers do with greater reliability, and they can read CAT scans and MRIs more accurately than radiologists. And when I was talking to my accountant, my Kentucky CPAs, when they were in town not too long ago, they said that's the #1 thing they talk about, the existential threat that artificial intelligence is to CPAs. So it's not just truck drivers. Anyway, thank you all very much. Once again, it's been a stimulating discussion, and we appreciate your contributions very much. With no further business, this hearing's adjourned.